They said he saved the wrong boy that winter, said some debts come back wearing a uniform and carrying orders. The wind had teeth that night, the kind that cut through wool and bone alike, sweeping low across the plains until even the cattle turned their backs and waited it out. But Ethan Cole didn't turn back, not when he saw something small collapse against the white, not when the shape barely moved and the snow kept trying to claim it inch by inch, and by the time he reached it, boots crunching through drifts up to his knees, he realized it wasn't just a shape. It was a boy, no more than 8 or 9, skin pale from the cold, dark hair frozen in stiff strands against his forehead, breath so thin it came like a whisper against the storm, and for a second, just one, Ethan hesitated, not because of the cold, not because of the distance back to his cabin, but because of what the boy was, because even in that storm, even buried under snow and silence, Ethan could see it in the lines of his face, in the worn leather cord around his neck, in the faint markings pressed into the fabric beneath. His coat, Apache, the kind of word that got men talking low and loading rifles, the kind of word that turned help into hesitation, and hesitation into something worse, and the wind howled louder, as if it had an opinion, as if it wanted the choice made quickly. But Ethan didn't speak, didn't argue with himself, didn't weigh the cost the way other men might have. He just bent down, slow, careful, like the boy might break under his hands, and lifted him, feeling how light he was, how close to nothing. And that was when the boy's eyes opened for a second. Just a flicker, not fear, not relief, something else, something watchful, like he was measuring the man holding him even then, and Ethan held that gaze for a heartbeat before pulling his coat tighter around both of them and turning back toward the only light for miles, a cabin half buried in snow, where fire meant life and silence meant you'd made your choice already. And behind them the wind erased their tracks, as if none of it had ever happened, as if no one would ever know a man had stopped, had chosen, had carried something fragile through a storm that didn't care, and far off, beyond the hills and the drifting white, there were other eyes that would remember, other lives that would turn on that moment, though Ethan Cole wouldn't know it yet, wouldn't feel it until years later, when the sound of hooves would roll across his land like distant thunder, and men in uniform would stand where no one ever stood, waiting, silent, as if the past itself had come back to settle its account. The fire took time to answer, slow at first, a weak glow beneath the ash before it found its strength, licking upward in thin orange lines that pushed back the cold inch by inch, and Ethan knelt close to it with the boy wrapped in a worn wool blanket, his hands steady despite the stiffness in his fingers, moving with the kind of care that came from years of working alone, no wasted motion, no panic, just quiet persistence, because panic did not keep a man alive out here, and it sure did not keep a boy breathing either. And for a long while there was nothing but the crackle of wood and the sound of wind pressing against the cabin walls like it was trying to get in, like it had been denied something it wanted, and Ethan watched the boy's chest, waiting for each breath, counting them without meaning to, 1, 2, 3, shallow but there, still there, and when the boy stirred again, it was not sudden, just a shift beneath the blanket, a tightening of small fingers against the fabric, as if he was holding onto something unseen, and his eyes opened a second time, clearer now, dark and sharp despite the exhaustion, and they moved across the room, not in confusion, not in fear, but in quiet calculation, taking in the door, the window, the rifle resting against a far wall, and finally settling on Ethan himself, and there it was again, that same look from the storm, the kind that did not belong to a child who had been lost. It belonged to someone who had learned early that the world did not offer kindness without cost, and Ethan leaned back slightly, giving the boy space, even inside a cabin no bigger than 20 feet across, and after a moment he spoke, his voice low, steady, not asking too much, not offering too much either, just enough to bridge the silence. "You are safe here," he said, and the boy did not answer, not with words, only with a slight movement of his head that could have meant anything, could have meant nothing, and Ethan did not press him, because out here, trust was not given through questions, it was earned through time, through quiet actions repeated until they no longer felt like a threat. And he reached for a tin cup near the fire, pouring water from a kettle that had just begun to warm, holding it out carefully, not close enough to startle, not far enough to seem distant, and after a pause, the boy took it, hands still trembling but controlled, bringing it to his lips with the kind of restraint that spoke louder than words, and Ethan noticed the cord around his neck again, the small carved piece tied to it, worn smooth by years of touch. Something important, something that did not belong to a child wandering alone in a storm. And outside, the wind shifted, softer now, as if the night itself had decided to step back, and for the first time since he had lifted the boy from the snow, Ethan allowed himself to breathe without counting, but even then, he knew this was not the end of anything, just the beginning of something he could not yet see, something that had already started moving long before that storm ever found him. Morning did not come all at once. It crept in through the cracks of the cabin like something cautious, pale light slipping across the wooden floor, touching the edges of the table, the boots by the door, the rifle still resting where Ethan had left it, and the storm had moved on in the night, leaving behind a silence, so complete it almost rang in the ears, the kind of silence that made a man aware of every small sound, the shift of fabric, the faint hiss of dying embers, the quiet breathing of someone who had made it through the dark, and Ethan rose before the boy did, out of habit more than need, pulling on his coat and stepping outside for a moment, where the cold air bit sharp but clean, the sky stretched wide and clear, and the land lay buried under fresh snow that reached nearly a foot deep in places, smooth and untouched except for one thing, tracks, faint but there, not from the night before, but new, cutting across the open field about 50 yards from the cabin, a line of hoof prints, measured, spaced evenly, not wandering, not lost, riders who knew exactly where they were going, and Ethan stood still for a long second, eyes tracing the direction they came from and where they led, straight past his land, but close enough to see, close enough to notice. And he did not follow them, did not call out, just let the sight settle into his mind like another piece of something unfinished. Because out here, a man learned when to move and when to wait, and this felt like something that required waiting, and when he stepped back inside, brushing snow from his shoulders, he found the boy already awake, sitting upright now, blanket draped around him, eyes fixed on the door as if he had heard everything, as if he had known the moment Ethan stepped outside and returned, and there was more strength in him now, not much, but enough to sit, enough to watch, and Ethan moved slowly, not wanting to startle him, reaching for a small pan near the fire where he had left strips of dried meat warming, the smell filling the room in a way that felt almost foreign after the long night, and he set a piece within reach of the boy without a word, and again there was that pause, that careful space between offer and acceptance, before the boy took it, smaller bites. This time, deliberate, as if measuring how much he could take, and after a while, he spoke, voice rough but clear. They came close, he said, not a question, not a statement of fear, just fact, and Ethan did not pretend otherwise, did not soften it. They passed through, he replied, meeting the boy's gaze without challenge, and something shifted then, subtle, but there, the smallest easing in the boy's shoulders, not trust, not yet, but something that leaned in that direction. And Ethan noticed his eyes drift again to the rifle by the wall, not with fear, not with curiosity, but with recognition, and that told him more than words could have, told him this boy had seen more of the world than most his age ever should, had learned to read danger not by noise, but by stillness, and outside, the wind had stilled completely, leaving the land in a kind of quiet that felt like it was waiting for something to begin, and Ethan had the sense, deep and certain, that whatever path had crossed his door in the storm had not ended with the morning, it had only stepped into the light. By midday the sun hung low and pale, offering light without warmth, and the land stretched quiet in every direction, the kind of quiet that made a man aware of how alone he truly was. But inside the cabin something had shifted, something small but steady, like a balance finding its place, and the boy had moved from the edge of the bedroll to a stool near the fire, wrapped still in the blanket, but sitting straighter now, watching everything with those same careful eyes, and Ethan gave him space. The way he always had with wounded animals or strangers who did not yet know if they could stay, moving through his chores without asking questions, cutting wood, checking the water barrel, keeping his movements slow and predictable, because trust out here was not built on words, It was built on what a man did when no one was asking him to do it, and after a while the boy spoke again, his voice steadier now. "Why did you not leave me?" he asked, not accusing, not grateful, just asking the kind of question that came from someone who had learned that most people did leave, and Ethan paused for a moment, setting down the knife he had been using, thinking not for long but long enough to make sure the answer was true. "Because you were there," he said simply, and the boy studied him as if weighing that answer against something deeper, something he had been told before, something that had not matched what he had seen, and he nodded once, slow, accepting not the words, but the consistency behind them, and for the first time there was something like calm in his expression, not comfort, but the absence of constant readiness, and the hours passed without urgency, the fire kept alive, the cabin holding its quiet, until the boy stood on his own, unsteady but determined, moving to the small window and looking out across the white field, his gaze tracing the same distant line of tracks Ethan had seen earlier, and his hand rose unconsciously to the cord around his neck, fingers brushing the carved piece there, and when he spoke again, it was softer, almost to himself. "They will keep moving," he said, and Ethan stepped closer but not too close, following the direction of his gaze. "Then you should rest while you can," he replied. But the boy shook his head slightly, eyes still fixed beyond the land. "No," he said, "I cannot stay," and there was no fear in it, no reluctance, only certainty, the kind that did not belong to a child but to someone carrying something larger than himself, and Ethan felt the weight of that without fully understanding it, felt the moment turning without knowing where it would lead, and he did not try to stop him, did not tell him what he should do, because some paths were not meant to be redirected, only witnessed. And as the boy turned from the window, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders, there was a brief pause between them, a silence that held more than words could, and then the boy reached into the folds of the blanket and drew out the small carved piece from his neck, holding it for a second as if deciding something, before placing it carefully on the table between them, not as payment, not as thanks, but as something else entirely, something that felt like a marker, a promise, or maybe a memory waiting to be carried forward. And Ethan looked at it without touching it, understanding in that quiet way that this moment would not end when the boy walked out the door. It would stay, settle into the years ahead like something unfinished, something that would return when the time was right. The boy did not rush his leaving, and that alone told Ethan more than anything else could have, because those who ran from something usually moved fast, but those who walked toward something took their time, measuring each step like it mattered, and by late afternoon the light had softened, stretching long shadows across the snow as the boy stood near the door. The blanket folded now and set aside, his strength returned just enough to carry him forward, and Ethan leaned against the wall beside the window, arms loose at his sides, watching without interfering, because there was nothing to stop and nothing to hold, only something to witness, and the carved piece still lay on the table between them, catching a faint line of sunlight that made its worn edges glow, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence settling into something steady, not empty, not heavy, just present, and then the boy spoke, not looking at Ethan, but at the door. "You will not follow," he said, and it was not a question, and Ethan gave a slight shake of his head. "No," he answered, simple as before, and the boy nodded once, as if confirming something already decided, and he reached for the handle, pausing only long enough to glance back, not in fear, not in doubt, but in acknowledgement, a quiet recognition that something had been done here that did not need to be named. And then he stepped outside, into the cold that had softened but not left, boots pressing into the snow with careful steps, leaving a line of prints that would not last long under the open sky, and Ethan watched from the doorway as the boy moved across the field, small against the wide land, heading toward a horizon that gave no answers, and he did not call out, did not offer a final word, because some departures were not meant to be interrupted, and as the distance grew, the boy did something unexpected. He stopped, just for a moment, and turned slightly. Not enough to see his face, just enough to show he was still aware of the man behind him, and then he continued on, disappearing slowly into the folds of the land until there was nothing left but the faint trail of his passing, and even that began to fade as the wind returned in soft whispers, brushing over the snow as if to erase what had been. And Ethan stood there longer than he needed to, longer than made sense, eyes fixed on where the boy had vanished, not searching, not waiting, just holding the moment in place. And when he finally stepped back inside, closing the door against the quiet cold, the cabin felt different, not emptier, but marked, like something had been left behind that did not take up space, but still changed the room, and his gaze fell to the table where the carved piece remained, still resting where the boy had placed it, and this time Ethan stepped closer, reaching out slowly, not out of curiosity, but out of understanding, fingers closing around the worn surface, feeling the grooves carved by hands that had known purpose, and he turned it once in the light, not trying to decipher it, not needing to, because its meaning was not in what it showed, but in why it had been left. And outside, the land stretched on as it always had, quiet and unchanging, but somewhere beyond it, something had begun to move, something tied to this small object, to that boy, to a choice made without hesitation, and Ethan placed the carving near the edge of the table where the light could reach it, not hidden, not displayed, just there, as if waiting, the way some things do when they are not finished yet. Time did not mark itself in loud ways after that winter. It settled quietly, one season folding into the next until the memory of that night became something distant but never gone, and Ethan Cole lived the same way he always had, steady, alone, rising with the sun, working the land that gave little but demanded everything, fixing fences, hauling water, patching wood that split under heat and cold. And the carved piece remained where he had left it, near the edge of the table where light touched it each morning, sometimes catching his eye, sometimes forgotten for days at a time, but never moved, never tucked away because it did not belong to the past, not entirely, and the town a few miles off never changed much either, though the people there had their opinions, quiet at first, then less so, because word traveled in ways that did not need proof, and someone had seen tracks that winter. Someone had heard that Ethan Cole had taken in a boy not his own, not one of their kind. And that was enough to shape the story into something else, something sharper. And when Ethan came into town for supplies, the looks followed him. Not open hostility, not spoken accusations, just distance, the kind that closed doors without slamming them, the kind that made a man aware. He stood alone even in a crowd, and Ethan did not argue with it, did not defend himself, because he had never lived for their approval, and he was not about to start now. And so the years passed, one after another, marked by dry summers and hard winters, by cattle that came and went, by tools that wore down and were replaced, and through it all, nothing returned, no riders, no signs, no answers, just the land and the work and the quiet, until even the memory of the boy began to feel like something imagined, something shaped by cold and solitude rather than truth. And yet, there were moments, small and sudden, when Ethan would pause in the middle of a task, eyes drifting toward the horizon without reason, a feeling settling in his chest that something had shifted somewhere beyond sight, not danger, not warning, just movement, like a story continuing out of view. And one late afternoon, years later, when the sky hung low with clouds that promised snow again, Ethan stood by the fence line, checking a loose post, when he noticed something that did not belong. Far off at the edge of his land, where the trail cut between two low hills, there were tracks fresh, clean, not scattered like cattle, not wandering like travelers, but straight, measured, more than one, more than a few, spaced evenly as if they moved with purpose. And he straightened slowly, hand resting on the top rail, eyes narrowing not in fear but in recognition of pattern, because he had seen something like this before, long ago, and the wind carried no sound from that distance, no voices, no metal, just the quiet rhythm of movement that had not yet arrived, and Ethan did not move toward it, did not reach for his rifle, did not call out. He simply watched, the same way he had watched the boy walk away years before, because some things, once set in motion, did not need to be chased. They came on their own time, and as the light faded and the first snow began to fall again in slow, deliberate flakes, Ethan turned back toward the cabin, knowing without knowing why that whatever had begun in that storm long ago was no longer distant. It was on its way back. The snow did not fall hard that evening. It drifted down in slow, steady flakes that softened the land and quieted every sound, and by the time darkness settled in, the world beyond Ethan's cabin had turned into something muted and distant, the kind of night where a man could hear his own breathing if he stood still long enough. And Ethan did stand still, just inside the doorway, his hand resting lightly against the wood as his eyes traced the fading line of tracks at the far edge of his land. Now half covered but still there, still deliberate, still coming, and he closed the door without hurry, not to shut anything out, but because the moment had moved inside with him, and the fire crackled low, casting long shadows that shifted across the walls, touching the table where the carved piece still rested, unchanged, waiting the way it always had, and Ethan moved to it without thinking, fingers brushing its surface once before turning away, as if acknowledging something that no longer needed explanation, and outside, far beyond the reach of the firelight, the riders drew closer, their movement steady and controlled, not the scattered rhythm of travelers, but the measured pace of men who moved together, and by the time the moon rose high enough to cast a pale glow across the snow, they had reached the boundary of his land, stopping just beyond the fence line as one. No voices, no signals, only stillness, and one figure at the front shifted slightly in the saddle. Not to lead, but to confirm, and then they moved again, slower now, crossing onto the land with the same quiet purpose that had carried them across miles of open country, and inside the cabin, Ethan sat by the fire, boots planted firm, hands resting loosely on his knees, not tense, not relaxed, simply present, the way he had been that night years ago when the storm brought something unexpected to his door, and time seemed to fold in on itself, the past and the present aligning without effort, until the sound finally came, soft at first, the distant rhythm of hooves pressing into fresh snow, growing clearer with each passing second, not rushed, not hidden, just arriving, and Ethan did not reach for the rifle against the wall, did not stand, did not prepare for anything beyond what was already happening, because something in the sound told him this was not a threat, not a warning, but a return, and the horses came to a stop just outside the cabin, their breath visible in the cold air, their forms outlined in moonlight, and then silence again, deeper this time, heavier with meaning, as if the land itself was holding still to witness what would come next, and Ethan remained where he was, eyes steady, listening, waiting not with fear but with recognition, because he had known this moment would come, not in a way he could name, not in a way he could predict, but in the same quiet certainty that had guided him years before, when he chose to stop in the snow, when he chose to carry something fragile through a storm that did not care, and now, as the night settled around the cabin and the presence outside held its ground without a single word, Ethan Cole understood one simple truth. Some choices do not end when they are made. They travel, they grow, and one day, they find their way back home. The knock did not come like a demand. It came like a signal, 3 measured strikes against the wood, firm but not forceful, the kind a man gives when he expects to be heard, not feared, and Ethan let the sound settle before he moved, rising from his chair with the same unhurried motion he had carried through the years, every step deliberate as he crossed the floor toward the door, the fire behind him casting a low glow that followed at his back. And when he opened it, the cold slipped in first, sharp and clean, followed by the sight of them. Rows of mounted men stretching beyond the edge of the clearing, their horses still, their posture straight, their presence filling the quiet without breaking it, and at the front, just a few feet from the threshold, one rider sat slightly ahead of the others, his uniform catching the pale moonlight, brass buttons dim but steady, his hat low but not hiding the line of his face, older now, stronger, shaped by years that had not been easy, but there was something in the way he held himself that had not changed, something Ethan recognized before the man even spoke, and when he did, his voice carried. Across the space between them, calm, clear, not raised, "Ethan Cole," he said, not as a question, but as acknowledgement, and Ethan met his gaze without hesitation, seeing now what time had done, how the boy from the storm had become this man, this officer, this presence that commanded not just the riders behind him, but the silence itself, and for a moment neither of them moved, the years between them hanging in that space like something tangible, something that could not be rushed or reduced to a simple exchange. And then the man dismounted, boots touching the snow with a soft crunch, and he stepped forward, closing the distance until he stood just outside the doorway, not crossing the threshold, not assuming more than was given, and his eyes shifted briefly past Ethan, toward the table inside, toward the place where the carved piece still rested, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, just a subtle recognition, a confirmation that what had been left had remained, that what had been done had not been forgotten, and he straightened slightly, turning back toward the men behind him, raising one hand in a motion so precise it needed no explanation, and in that instant the entire line responded as one, a movement that rippled through the stillness with perfect unity, rifles lifted in silent salute, not aimed, not threatening, but held in a way that spoke of respect, of discipline, of something earned rather than given, and the sound of metal shifting in unison filled the air for a brief second before settling again into quiet, and Ethan stood there, the door open, the cold pressing against his coat, watching as this moment unfolded without a single wasted word, and the man in front held his position, eyes steady, voice lower now, meant only for the space between them. "You did not ask who I was," he said, and Ethan gave the smallest shake of his head. "Did not need to," he replied, and the man nodded once, a faint breath visible in the air between them, and for a second, just a second, the years fell away, leaving only the memory of a storm, a fire, and a choice made without hesitation, and then the present returned, solid and undeniable, standing there in the form of a man who had come back not with words, not with explanations, but with something far greater, something that could not be misunderstood, because out here, respect was not spoken, it was shown. And what stood before Ethan Cole that night was not a debt repaid, it was a truth made visible. The rifles lowered as one, not rushed, not abrupt, but with the same quiet discipline that had lifted them, and the sound faded into the cold night like something that had never needed to be loud to be understood, and for a long moment no one spoke, not the riders, not the man standing before the door, not Ethan Cole, because there was nothing left that required words, the meaning of it all already settled in the space between them, carried not by explanation but by time, by memory, by a single choice made years ago when no one was watching, and the officer's gaze lingered on Ethan just a second longer before he turned slightly, his eyes drifting once more toward the inside of the cabin, toward the table where the carved piece still rested in the firelight, and he stepped forward just enough to reach the threshold, not crossing it, not claiming anything that had not been offered, and his hand moved slowly, deliberately, until it hovered over the carving, pausing there as if measuring the distance between past and present, before he picked it up with a care that spoke louder than any salute, fingers tracing its worn edges the same way they once had as a boy, and for a brief second the uniform, the rank, the years all seemed to fall away, leaving only that moment in the storm, the fire, the silence, and the man who had chosen to stay, and he looked back at Ethan, something steady and unspoken in his eyes, something that did not need to be named to be understood. And then he placed the carving back on the table exactly where it had been, not taking it, not reclaiming it, but leaving it where it belonged, because some things were not meant to be returned. They were meant to remain as markers of what had been done and what had been carried forward, and without another word, he stepped back into the cold, turning with quiet precision as he raised his hand once more, not as a command this time, but as a signal of completion, and the riders behind him responded in the same measured silence, rein shifting, horses turning as one, their movements smooth, controlled, the kind that came from long miles and shared purpose, and they began to leave the way they had come, no rush, no noise beyond the steady rhythm of hooves pressing into fresh snow, fading slowly into the distance until they became nothing more than shapes against the night, then shadows, then nothing at all, and Ethan remained where he was, the door still open, the cold air settling around him as the last trace of their presence disappeared into the wide land, and he did not follow, did not call out, because there was nothing to hold on to and nothing to add, only the quiet understanding that what had returned had also chosen to leave, complete in its own way, and after a while he stepped back inside, closing the door with a soft, final sound, the fire still burning low. The cabin unchanged, and yet not the same, and his eyes found the carving on the table once more, resting in the same place, touched by the same light, and he moved closer, not to take it, not to move it, just to stand there for a moment, looking at something that had carried a story across 12 years without a single word, and outside, the wind picked up again, gentle this time, moving across the snow like a whisper that did not disturb what had already been said, and Ethan Cole turned away from the table, settling back into the quiet of his life, knowing in that steady way that out here, a man was not remembered for what he said or what he claimed, but for who chose to come back when the world had every reason not to, and in the end, that was enough.